Hi, my name is Jack Malik. I'm from Projek Rabak. Projek Rabak is an artist collective from Ipoh, Perak, Malaysia. Yeah, I'm also from Ipoh, Perak. I'm a poet, also a proofreader, and I'm working in a local publications. The title of my presentation is called of Sacred Remembrance. Sacred Remembrance. It's a line from a poem by a Malaysian poet. It goes by the name Salleh Ben Joned, Sajak Salleh. So I like that line because sacred remembrance. Go figure. We need to remember where we came from. So that is one of the topics I will be discussing today, and then I will touch a little bit on collectivism, because I believe that I'm from an artist collective. I believe that poets, artists, they can flourish even better if they're in a collective, in a team. And also a short introduction, a short like glimpse of, since we're talking about the past, we also need to talk about the present and the future, but most importantly the present. So Bismillah, let's start with our presentation of Sacred Remembrance, Malaysian poetry through the eyes of a millennial Malaysian poet. The contents, as I said, bridging the ages, a quick glance of what Malay poetry talks about throughout the decades, artist collectivism in Malaysia, Anak Alam and Projek Rabak. Anak Alam was an artist collective also. It's an art collective back in the 70s. We will get through that later on. It's a brief commentary on activism roles. There's a typo, on collectivism roles in Malaysian literature. And the last one is Sastra is Nothing. Sastra means literature in Malay. The Poetics of Malaysian Millennials. Bridging the Ages. What is puisi? Puisi in Malay is called poetry. Poetry is puisi, puisi is poetry. So puisi is an umbrella term for both the modern and traditional side of it. So traditional Malay poetry, we have pantun, seloka, syair, dan gurindam. All these four have different styles, different rhymes, different restrictions, but it all falls under traditional form. And then we have modern Malay poetry. Modern Malay poetry, there's only one, which is called Sajak. So puisi and sajak can be interchangeable nowadays, but to be specific, sajak is modern, puisi is an umbrella term, and the most I can simply explain what is sajak. Just imagine free verse. However, sajak wasn't in the form of free verse initially. So this is the example of a pantun, one of my favorite pantun actually. Air dalam bertambah dalam, hujan di hulu bertambah belum lagi teduh. Hati dendam bertambah dendam, dendam dahulu belum lagi sembuh. The translated version, I will apologize beforehand. This is a very rough, very unpolished, very unelegant translation, but this is what I understand from the Malay text. Deep water becomes even deeper. On top of the mountain, rain keeps pouring still. A vengeful heart unresolved festers. All vengeance unhealed, its painful throbbing still. So the characteristic of a pantun is that the rhyme scheme is A-B. It has around 9 to 11 syllables. The two important aspects of a pantun is that number one, it is nature-based. It draws from nature, like a haiku. For example, haiku, it has to be about the season, whether it's spring, winter, autumn, or summer. So pantun in that aspect draws from nature. and the surrounding. So a good pantun takes on its surrounding, but a great pantun takes on nature. So the second part is that, which is the main part of the pantun, is the foreshadowing. The early part of a pantun, air dalam bertambah dalam, hujan di hulu belum lagi teduh. That is the foreshadowing part of it. It foreshadows what the poet wants to speak of actually. So, but that is the beauty of pantun for me. And then we get to the core of the message. For the Malay worldview of pantun, it takes on nature and it learns from nature. It's like the bigger universe and the smaller universe. So the bigger universe is nature and the smaller universe is the human condition. For example, a vengeful heart is similar to like a water that is running deeper. So that is what I understand, and I hope the listeners outside can also appreciate the beauty of pantun. So I talk about pantun a lot because pantun is this is where we turn from traditional, the transition from traditional into modern form. So this is an example of a proto Sajak, or you could also consider that this is Sajak. It was written by a poet by the name Pungguk. Pungguk was Pungguk in Malay is owl, if I'm not mistaken. So Pungguk, his real name was Muhammad Yassin Makmur. He was a school teacher back in the 1930s. So what he wrote, as I mentioned before, pantun has foreshadow and the core. Pungguk or Muhammad Yassin didn't believe, or rather believe that the foreshadowing has no longer served its purpose in Sajak. So he mixed together the foreshadowing and the core to create a new form. Waktu senja burung terbang, waktu adinda bersedih cita, hancur dan lebur di kalbu abang, sedihkan adik panah dewata. In the evening where birds flew, in the time my beloved is grieving, my heart broken by you, mourning over you, my darling. Okay, it has the A-B scheme. It has the sounding of a pantun. But if we put ourselves in the position of a, let's say back in the 1930s, we would like go ape shit on this. Like, oh, what the hell? This is not pantun because it doesn't have the foreshadowing. But this is the beauty of it. This is the exact moment where traditional pantun, traditional poetry, puisi, transition into modern poetry. So bridging the ages. So I wouldn't like share the poetry of the ages of the decades, but I will like give a brief explanation on what the themes are basically. So 1930s, more of innovation of pantun. So we transition from pantun to sajak or puisi to sajak. In the 1930s, there's the advent of World War II and whatnot. Social and political awareness was a thing in the Malay culture. So what the poets back then weren't actually poets full time. They were actually teachers. So these educators, they have social and political awareness of the nation and also of the people, and then they push forward for reformation. They push forward for cultural social revolutions through literature. And then we went to 1940s. 1940s was the Japanese occupation. So this is post-colonial. So as I mentioned, in 1930s, we have social and political awareness. So the poets back then, they believe that literature has to speak about these topics, the social and political awareness of this topic. So back then, the Japanese propaganda push for Asia Raya, or translate as Greater Asia Spirit. This one is a propaganda push for independence for Asian country, independence in terms of to fight colonialism and imperialism. But as we know, the Japanese has their own agenda, and then another form of imperialism. But that paved way to a newer spirit, a newer independence. So the 1950s, we have two phases. The number one is independence phases, and then the post-independence phase. So the difference between these two phases is that during the independence phase, the poets like Usman Awang, Masuri SN. Masuri SN is a Singaporean poet and also a Malaysian poet. We also speak of Masuri SN. He's one of these two, Masuri SN and Usman Awang, is a big figure in Malay poetry back in the 50s. So anyway, during the independence phase, Malay poets and Malay poetry strive for independence, strive for informing the masses that this is the importance of independence. We need to band together to strive for independence. It's not yet nation building. I believe the nation building part comes at the second phase of 1950, which is post-independence. Malaysia or West Malaysia gained independence in 1957. Back then, post 1957s, which is late 50s and early 60s, Malaysia was striving for nation building. So the poems of late 50s and early 60s was about the people, about nation, basically about nation building. Yeah. So we have a lot of poets that write on that theme. Then we came to the 1960s. So in 1960s, it is the dawn of experimentation for Malay literature, Malay poetry and literature. For example, A. Samad Said, he's one of our Malaysian national laureate. In one of his poem, tanyalah Sputnik dan Explorer yang melanggar dadaku, tanyalah Nautilus dan jet pelisit yang menembus kepalaku. So the word like jet, Nautilus, Sputnik, Explorer, those are new lexicon that were inserted into the Malay language and used in Malay poetry. And then it is a fully developed form. It is more free verse than Punggut's Sajak, which is basically a new form, neo-pantun, if you say that. So in the 60s, that is where we see Malay poetry there's no hint at all of a pantun. It is a fully formed Sajak. That is what I believe in the 60s. And then in the 1970s, we entered the golden age of modern Malay poetry. In the 70s, we have three major names, which is also another Malaysian poet, Malaysian national laureate by the name of Muhammad Haji Salleh. So we also have Bahazin, Datuk Bahazin. He's another Malaysian national laureate poet. And then we have Latif Mohidin, what do you call a poet painter. So these three names in the 70s, they were the giants of the modern Malay poetry. Muhammad Haji Salleh with his intellectualism, Bahazin with his juxtaposition of traditional versus modernity, not in form, but in theme, in content. He was talking about the traditional side and also the modern side of the Malay culture, the Malaysian culture. And then we have Latif. Latif Mohidin was a poet painter. he studied abroad in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, and came back with very colorful, very interesting perspective. So, so these three people pave way to very high benchmark for Malay poetry, I believe. And then the 1980s, 1990s, and then the noughties onwards. By the 80s, we have a plethora of stylistics and poetics. We have Islamic poets that talk about Islam. We have global poets that talk about global issues like Palestine. And then we have experimentalists even more, not in just words, new lexicon inserted into the Malay poetry, but also in form and style and visuals. We can look at the examples of the 1980s poem. This is titled Sepi, or Silent, or Loneliness in Malay. It was written or made, I don't know whether it's written or made, as you can see. It was made by a poet by the name of T. alias Tai. He was also a prominent name in the 1970s and 80s. However, back in his time was underrated. That said, with newer technologies like the internet, and then the younger people, like the younger generations of poets and also readers, fully appreciating his content, search for him again. So T. alias Taib now is a celebrated poet. He's a 1980s poet. So Sepi is just a blank space, blank, square in one of his books. It was made in 1986. Yeah, we can see from T. alias Taib's Sepi, visual arts influences, seep into this one. If we see Malaysian 1980s experimentation, and then compare it to, let's say, the Western side, they've done this. Apollinaire has done this before the 21st century. A lot of poets, a lot of artists have done similar works like Sepi, like Aram Saroyan, John Cage, and whatnot. So, but I always welcome this kind of experimentation, and sadly we see not many of this style anymore in contemporary Malay poetry. And then this is Taktun by Abdul Ghaffar Ibrahim. He was a prominent, also I would say underrated poet back in the 70s and 80s. The poem was inspired by Silat. Silat is a Malay martial art. During the Silat, when the practitioners open their moves, they would be accompanied by a drum that is made by a goat or cow skin. The drum is called kompang. So the kompang is beaten to make a beat. If I'm not mistaken, it goes like tak 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 tun, tak 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 tun, tak 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 tun, tak 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 tun, and then the practitioner would perform his martial art. So Abdul Ghaffar Ibrahim was also a Silat practitioner. So he was inspired by Silat and thus created Taktun. And he basically created this form, this one reminds me of Apollinaire calligram, John Cage even. So this was the 1980s, 1970s experimentation side. So back in the 80s and 90s, especially post 90s and post 2000, the Malay poetry didn't really have, for me personally, I would like throwback and looking back, they didn't really have a prominent topic or theme. It was still basically shadowed by the 1970s, 1980s poets and style. And then the poets from 1970 and 1980s didn't really expand their style and whatnot. So that we will discuss when did the Malay poetry boom again. Now we are discussing about the artist collectivism in Malaysian literature. I think it's an important topic because it's, number one, is rarely spoken about. And then I think collectivism is important for poets, for literature people to grow even more. So just a brief look on this. Back in the 1970s, we have Anak Alam. It was co-founded by Latif Muhyiddin, as I mentioned. Latif, he was a 70s poet. Ghaffar Ibrahim, the one that we saw doing the Taktun poem, and then Zulkifli Dahlan. Zulkifli Dahlan is a visual artist, if I'm not mistaken, and a few other people. It was founded in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The members for Anak Alam, mostly, they were involved in visual arts and literature. So a lot of journalists, poets, painters, even cartoonists. One of their prominent members were Datuk Lat. He's a national cartoonist. Datuk Lat is famous for Lat Budak Kampung. Then we have Siti Zainun Ismail, our 14th Malaysian National Laureate, and the second female National Laureate after Zurina Hassan. And we have Latif Muhyiddin, painter poet. One of his famous paintings is Pagu Pagu. And then my artist collective is co-founded by Muhammad Jezwan. Muhammad Jezwan is an artist, he's an all-rounder. He is a musician, filmmaker, author, and a lot of other titles. So he founded Projek Rabak in Ipoh, Perak, Malaysia in 2011. Most of our members were involved in literature, film, music, performance art, and visual arts, and other aspects. And then our prominent accolade was that this year we participated in Venice Biennale under the name Hit Bersama Indigenous Pop. So this one, it wasn't literature, but we did incorporate elements of visual arts, performance, and whatnot. Apologies for the blurred image, but this is a cartoon made by Datuk Lat. It was a scene where Abdul Ghaffar Ibrahim read Taktun, his poem. So this was Anak Alam, and this is an example of Projek Rabak creative collaboration between its members. Ranarim is a visual artist based in Kuala Lumpur. We did a art video poetry together, titled Hawa Brehi. You can find in YouTube. It's still there. So this is one of our collaborative projects. So we expand not just from the stage and page, but beyond. And this is why I mentioned that it is important for poets to form a collective and to explore not only literature, but other sides of art disciplines. For example, filmmaking, performance art, and whatnot. So this is partly based on performance art. Sastra is Nothing is a line from Muhammad Jezwan's book, poetry collections, Sajak Gustavo. So the context is that he was at James Joyce's grave. So Jezwan, being he doesn't really consider himself as a poet. He just writes poems and poetry. But he was there at James Joyce's grave, and he thought to himself how funny, how humorous is that other people, the serious type in people that do literature, the serious ones, most of them doesn't have the privilege to be in front of James Joyce's grave. So he made like a satire of that, like Sastra is Nothing, Rajang Terpelanting, but in a very zen and humoristic point of view, that Sastra is nothing, literature is nothing. poem is just a poem. There's nothing more, nothing less. But I think that's the beauty of it. So yeah. So the Malaysian millennial poetics, I would say that it started early 2010. So this is, as I mentioned, back in the noughties and 80s and the 90s, Malaysian poetry isn't really moving. It's there, but it's still moving. What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't have that edginess up until 2010. So 2010 we have is similar to the 1950s. We have two phases of it. We have the early 2010 period, and also the late 2010 period. And then we have the current time now, which is we are still in the early 2020. So I'm going to talk about this three period. So the poetics of Malaysian millennials, the early 2010. Basically, the early 2010 is the rise of indie literature. However, the term indie is problematic to be used in literature, because I feel that, let's take example Coldplay. I hope everyone knows Coldplay. Before they went mainstream, I'm talking about Yellow and the Scientist Coldplay, that period. If you ask me personally, I wouldn't consider Coldplay as indie, but I would consider him as alternative because of the sound they were producing. So I believe that it's similar with in Malay literature. Is it indie based on the production, or is it based on the style or the content? Because we need to like take this thing into consideration. Then we have the late 2010. Most of the earlier poets back in the early 2010 and also the publisher are no longer active, sadly, because of life. But we do have newer faces of poets and publishers. I would consider that I'm from the late 2010. I started doing poetry in 2015. So I was really right smack in the middle of the decline. I started at 2015. This is where the most of the earlier poets starting to slow down a bit on their work. They were not producing any more newer works. I wouldn't say not producing newer works, but they were busy with their lives and whatnot. So I was like in the decline. The publishers were having hard time selling poetry books and whatnot. But then I was the newer faces of poets back at the late 2010. So yeah. And then early 2020 is the newer and older generations. When I say older generations, it's not from the early 2010, but it was from the 70s. Poets from 80s resurface again. So we are sharing the same spotlight. So newer publishers right now, for example, one of my publishers, Caterpillar Books, they started reprinting older generations poets from the 80s, like Rahimidin Zahiri, Moktawang, and then Muhammad Haji Saleh. They recently published a few months ago. The problem with the older generations is that their books nowadays is very hard to find and very limiting. It's very limited for us to like search for them. So the newer publishers now reprinting them for us to like see what is the body of work these older generations have. This is an example of early 2010 poems. This one is called Cyclone. Hello Taufan. Habis porak peranda aku engkau kerjakan. That's about it. That's it. So it's like a very Tumblr Instagramish style of poetry, because the millennials and the Gen Zs, we are brought up by the internet. So our poetics are different from older generations of poets. So this is by Mimi Morticia. The book is called Tangerine Dan Nicotine. It was published by back in 2009. So yeah, hello Typhoon. How devastated you left me in your week. So very like snappy, very cliche, very a new style, new age of Malay poetry. It took the older generations to and also the conventionalist poets to understand this type of poetry, but it was met with some pushbacks early on, but now I would it's safe to say that it's generally accepted, and I think I believe that younger generations of readers prefer this kind of poems compared to the very intellectual, very literature style. And then we have the late 2010 poem. This is by Ridwan Saidi, Holocaust. There's a bit of typo here. It was published in 2016, titled Denim. Langit malam, denim lusuh, shrink fit, tak mau ku basuh 1000 tahun. So, as I said, the newer lexicon like shrink fit, you wouldn't find this kind of word like denim or shrink fit inside in 19 even below 2010's poetry. You wouldn't find this kind of poems and this kind of words. So indie alternative poetry in Malay poetry. Yeah. Then lastly, we have example of early 2010 poems. This is one of my friend. His name is Alif Awan. Pada malam tak boleh tidur. Fun fact: Alif once slam for the Causeway Exchange slam poetry back in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, 2017, 2018. Yeah, Alif slam for the CX in Singapore. However, that year Malaysian didn't win. It was a landslide win for Singapore. So anyway, pada malam tak boleh tidur, Alif Awan, hal lewat malam. Gitar kayu pecah, notasi muzik koyak, kekunci piano tercabut, lollipop patah, gula-gula hancur. Lepas wrecking ball, langgar condominium, cari sedih. The acoustic guitar smashed, the musical sheets torn, the piano keys broken, the lollipop snapped, the candy crushed after the wrecking ball busted the condominium searching for proof. So we can see how the Malaysian poetry transcend from or transition from 1930s until early 2020. We can see that we no longer write waktu senja burung terbang, waktu adinda bersedih cita. We can compare that with lepas wrecking ball, langgar condominium, cari sedih. So we move from a lot of different and very, very interesting phases throughout the decade, and I'm honestly excited to see what more that we can give at the end of like this decade, like at the end of 2020, and then what beckons us in Malaysian poetry, Malaysian Malay poetry for the 2030s. I would say that closing note is that Malaysian poetry is ever changing. I have a book it's not here with me. It was written by an Indonesian scholar. It's Professor Umar Junus. It's a dated work. It's a dated research. It was done in the 1970s. So Professor Umar Junus wrote the book titled Perkembangan Puisi Modern Malaysia, which is translated as the development of modern Malay poetry, modern Malay poetry, and it speaks about the Malay poetry of Indonesia and the Malay poetry of Malaysia. So Umar Junus mentioned that the Indonesians Malay poetry, they cut tie with tradition. So they push away tradition, if I'm not mistaken, what I understand from Majunus, and then they embrace local cultures. For example, Indonesia, if we what I understand, and if I think what our viewers understand, is that it's made out of smaller islands. So you have the Sunda tribe, the Javanese tribe, the Minang tribe. There's a lot of combinations, you know, there's a lot of regional. So Indonesia back then moved toward regional poetics, whereas in Malaysia, our Malay poetry tradition, we didn't sever the tie, but we more like, as you can see, Pungguk still kept the pantun form. So we Malaysian Malay poets, we more like improvise. We make innovation. So we move with the traditional form, the traditional poetic, the traditional spirit, but bringing newer breath to it. So that is what I learned from reading Umar Junus' work. I could be wrong. I am only just one source person. What I spoke for the last half an hour, 1 hour, is basically part of the bigger picture in Malay, in this region, and in this poetics of this region, because it's an oral, and also it's a very very subjective matter. As much as I am trying to my best to be subjective about it, there are outdated informations, there are newer informations that I haven't had the time and privilege to access. But that is the beauty of it. I think it opens up for conversation, it opens up for what do you call this, for discourse. So I hope that this video made by Singlit opens up the discourse for not only for the international region, which is the neighboring region of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Brunei, but also maybe for the local practitioner also. They would say like, okay, Jack says like this, but I think he's wrong on this part, yada yada yada, and they make a counter, what do you call it? They argue for it, which is the positive argument, that is not just, you know, criticism, and not just like blind criticism and like straight up hating. So anyway, yeah, I hope that opens up for more discourses. So basically that's the Malaysian poetry from a practitioner's point of view, from a young practitioner's point of view. Anyway, thank you, Carissa. Thank you, Singlet. My name is Jack Malik. I'm from Projek Rabak, and hope to see you guys in real life soon. I hope to come back to Singapore again. And all right, Assalamualaikum and salam.